Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Welcome to Earth Optimism 2020. This will be a deep dive. Today, I'm happy to introduce Marcel Huijser, who will discuss recent advances in road ecology. Marcel studies wildlife transportation issues for the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University, and he is also a visiting professor of road ecology at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. 25 million kilometers of new roads are expected to be built globally by 2050. That's enough to encircle the Earth over 600 times. Roads are one of the primary threats to wildlife worldwide, fragmenting habitats and contributing to millions of wildlife fatalities through collisions. However, researchers like Marcel and others are developing methods to reduce these impacts, and today Marcel is going to tell us all about them. During the talk, if you would like to ask a question, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. You can send a question at any point during the talk, and I will be receiving them. And then at the end, I will present them to Marcel, those which we have time to answer. So in the upper right hand of your screen, you'll see a little question box, and that's where you can type in your questions. Thank you very much, and welcome, Marcel.
Okay, can you hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction, Tremaine. Much appreciated. Today I will talk about road ecology, and before I start, I want to recognize that I don't do this work alone. The work I'll present on today is actually done by dozens and dozens of people. This is what I look like, but you can also see me on the screen. I work for Montana State University at WTI, and we are an entity that does contract research for transportation agencies, natural resource management agencies, and other entities. I also teach and have students both in the United States and Brazil. Now, about this talk, I'll explain to you what road ecology is and my perspective on what direction we should go in this field, taking turns, so you will. And finally, at the end, I'll discuss some opportunities and hopefully inspire some optimism. Now, roads are almost everywhere on the planet. Wherever you see these dark areas on this map, that's where we have a high density of roads. And it's really only the Arctic, rainforests like the Amazon, and deserts and high mountain plateaus where we do not have a high concentration of roads. So what this shows is that if we do conservation almost anywhere in the world, we have to deal with roads. Now, road ecology really is at the intersect between civil engineering on one hand, where we deal with infrastructure and traffic, and ecology on the other hand, where we deal with the physical environment and the organisms that live in it. It's very broad, but what I will talk about today is mostly terrestrial wildlife, and I won't deal with air, I won't deal with water and aquatic organisms, but I do recognize that it is all part of road ecology as well. Now, historically, people have been interested in our own interests, especially when we drive at night in rural areas. We don't like to crash into large wild mammals. It is not good for our cars, it's not good for our own safety. Now, if we look at this graph, first at the upper line up above the black line, it shows the total number of crashes, all types of crashes combined in the United States between 1990 on the left-hand side and 2004 on the right-hand side. It has remained relatively stable at about 6 million per year. In the same time period, a sub-selection of these data, the wildlife vehicle correlations, have increased by about 50%. So that's the gray line down below. So wildlife vehicle crashes have become more numerous, and they form a greater and greater percentage of the total number of crashes that take place. And this justifies increased attention to wildlife vehicle crashes and what we can do to reduce it. So that has been our historical interest, our own human safety. Of course, there's impacts to wildlife and the natural environment at large as well. Most notably, when we build a road, we cut vegetation, we build up the road bed, we have pavement, and now we put cars on that pavement. Nothing should be able to live or want to be able to live on that pavement. So we lose habitat. It's no longer forest, it's no longer grasslands, it is pavement. The second type of effect on wildlife is when we have vehicles and some animals still on that same pavement, then we have collisions, and that results in dead and injured animals. Third type of effect is the barrier effect. We have animals that move through the landscape, but when they want to access the area on the other side of a highway, they have difficulty doing so. It is difficult for them to cross the highway, much more so than moving through the landscape without a road being present. Then there's a decreasing habitat quality in a zone adjacent to the highway. It can range from a few meters when we're dealing with some runoff and road salt situations, but up to maybe a few kilometers when we're talking about noise pollution or human presence and disturbance radiating from the highway. So this is a zone adjacent to the highway where the habitat quality is just not quite as good as it would have been without a highway. And then we have the area, the verge, the roadside verge between the edge of the pavement and the right-of-way fence. It's a heavily disturbed habitat. The roadbed has been built up, so unnatural substrate. We have a disturbed hydrology. We have introduced non-native species that are resistant to mowing and cutting so that we can maintain a clear zone so that drivers can regain control of their vehicle, at least for a few yards after they have left the pavement. And this is a habitat in which invasive non-native species can thrive. And from there on, they can also invade the surrounding countryside. But how we value roadside verges is dependent on context. For example, if we have the Midwest in the United States, that used to be grassland, but it is now largely corn and other intensive agriculture, then your roadside verge vegetation might be a last refugium, a last place for certain plant species and animal species to live, because the surrounding area is much more affected. So the conservation status of the right-of-way is really context dependent. Now, a little about road mortality. From our own human safety perspective, we have been mostly interested in not hitting common large animals, large enough to cause substantial damage to our vehicles and be a risk to our own safety. These data are from South America, from Brazil, Sao Paulo state. And in Sao Paulo state, the most common hit large mammal is capybara. These animals, rodents, they weigh about 120 pounds, 60 kilograms or so, and they also move around in large herds. Now, when cars crash into them, it is not only an issue with regard to vehicle repair costs, but it's also causing human injuries and fatalities. But the main point of this table here is to illustrate the species circled in red. These are relatively rare, threatened species like maned wolf, giant anteater, and oncilla. So this is illustrating that we are also hitting species that are already at a great risk. And this is important because in many places in the world, we have historically taken action primarily when our own human safety is at stake. If we look at the map on the left-hand side, the state of California, the red areas are areas where we have a higher than expected concentration of deer vehicle crashes, higher than can be expected if it would have been random. The blue areas are lower than expected. So if you are mostly concerned about making it safe for people and not crashing into animals, the red areas are where you would prioritize taking action. Now, the map on the right-hand side shows where important habitat and corridors are in the state of California. And if you compare the two maps, it's immediately obvious that there's partial overlap, but there's also much more habitat and corridors that is important from a biological conservation perspective compared to the areas where you would focus on if you were only interested in reducing deer vehicle collisions. So my point is, if your objective is to make it safe for people, in most cases there's also a benefit for biological conservation, but there would be many road sections that would be left untouched that have a need for mitigation for biological conservation, but where human safety is not an issue. So what we have to do and make a turn, so you will, is develop better policies to implement action along road sections that are important for biological conservation, but where we don't have a substantial human safety consideration. I'm not saying that one departure point is good and the other is bad, just that there is a difference and we have to be aware of it. So I mentioned the word mitigation, and mitigation means reducing the effect, in this case of roads and traffic. Here we have a hypothetical habitat in green of a hypothetical species with a road cutting through it, and the arrows radiating from the road represent the road effect zone, where we have reduced the habitat quality. The road and the road effect zone, that is where we can reduce the effects, mitigate, so you will. But that is not the only thing we should consider, nor is it where we should start. We should really start by seeing if we need transportation infrastructure to begin with. If we need it, do we need a road? Do we need a railroad? Can we do it over water, by air? And if we decide it is a road, can we perhaps reroute the road away from the most sensitive locations and avoid the most severe impacts? That is really where we should start. You may still have areas where you want to mitigate and reduce the effect. And then a third step would be to potentially compensate or provide offsite mitigation by enlarging existing habitat patches, creating new habitat patches, and improving the connectivity between those patches. So my point is, it is not just about mitigation, it's a three-step approach, and you can have any combination of these three approaches. It's not one or the other. Now, again, historically, we've been interested in staying safe and not having vehicle damage. So we have put a lot of effort and thought into measures that would reduce collisions with large common animals, specifically deer species in different places of the world, and other large mammal species. And what we want is something that is simple, inexpensive, and it can be easily implemented tomorrow, preferably, over long distances. But it is important to realize that this is our desire. It doesn't necessarily mean that something like that exists. We've tried, for example, mirrors and reflectors reflecting the headlights of cars into the right-of-way, presumably scaring away animals. But it actually doesn't address the problem. It doesn't result in fewer collisions. What we've also done is we put wildlife warning signs out. Standard wildlife warning signs and ones that are enhanced, larger, have graphic images on them, they do not result in fewer collisions. So one of our most commonly applied mitigation measures, these signs, is actually not effective in addressing our problem. It is only when we have measures that are more specific in place and in time, like temporary warning signs along seasonal deer migration routes, for example, or animal detection systems that use technology in the right-of-way to detect large animals and then give a real-time warning. There's an animal on or near the road on this location right now. When we're time and location specific, then we do find evidence that it reduces collisions. Another thing people often say is, why don't we just reduce the posted speed limit? If we drive slower, surely we will hit fewer animals. There's some truth in that, but it's actually quite complicated, speed management. We have three types of speed. After we decide how fast we want to travel between city A and city B, then the engineers go to work and they decide this is the lane width, the shoulder width, the curvature, the sight distance we need, and that is consistent with a certain design speed. It allows people to drive a certain speed. The posted speed limit is typically a little bit below the design speed. The operating speed is the speed that we actually drive. Now, it's considered good practice to have the posted speed limit be very close to the design speed of a highway. If you reduce the posted speed limit substantially below the design speed, then you get speed dispersion. Most people will continue to drive the high speed that the design of the highway allows. Some people will adhere to the new, very low posted speed limit. So now you've got a mix of slow and fast moving vehicles, that's speed dispersion. And that is associated with an overall increase in crashes. Now, if our objective is to make the road safer for both people and wildlife, if we do this, we have a low posted speed limit, much lower than the design speed, we actually make it less safe for people. We have head-on collisions, irresponsible overtaking, because people get annoyed driving behind a slow vehicle. Now, how does it play out into the real world? This is a recently completed study in Wyoming, and there were winter sites for mule deer and also migration sites, seasonal migration. And what was done is the speed limit was lowered from 70 to 55 miles an hour at night. Now, instead of obtaining that reduction of 15 miles an hour, we only got a reduction of 3 to 5 miles an hour, making the point that people mostly respond to the design speed. What speed does it feel like you can drive safely on the road, regardless of what the posted speed limit says? More importantly, we didn't find a consistent or a significant change in collisions, illustrating the point. If you still want to use speed management as the primary tool to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, specifically with large mammals, then the question is, well, what speed should we aim for? What speed can we allow people to drive and expect a substantial reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions? Now, it's a complicated graph. I will only explain part of it. I'll move my cursor here to this dotted line here, the dashed line. And that is the distance, 75 meters, at which drivers can see with low beam a large animal, a moose, on the highway in the dark. So only when you're 75 meters distance can you start to see it. And then you have to think about what it is. It takes a few 1.5 to 2 seconds, and start hitting the brakes. So then you start to try and stop. If you look at those curves here, that is what the stopping distance is. And the faster you drive, that's the horizontal axis, the longer the stopping distance, and that's on the vertical axis. Now, if you look at that blue line, the blue dotted line, it actually tells us that if we have a median distance of 75 meters at which people can see a moose, that we can only allow people to drive 40 miles an hour at a maximum. And half the drivers have headlights that are too poor to still see the moose at 75 meters. They only see it when they're even closer, and they'll hit it for sure. So my point is, if we have highways that are designed for 55, 60, up to 80 miles an hour, you must ask people to drive 40 miles an hour at a max to obtain potentially a 50% reduction. You're not eliminating the problem, only cutting it in half. But there's such a big difference between the design speed of the highway and the speed you're trying to make these people drive at, 40 miles an hour or slower, that speed dispersion is a serious issue. And that leads me to the position that speed management is not a suitable measure if your objective is to substantially reduce collisions with large wild mammals on rural highways. Now, if you have a different type of road, for example, park roads, now the primary purpose of this road is no longer the fast transportation from A to B, which must also be safe, but the primary objective is to still be safe, but we are driving there because we want to see the area. We want to be in that area. It's not to travel quickly from A to B. So these roads, these park roads, typically have a very low design speed to begin with, and this is where speed management is a viable tool potentially, but not for our most of our highways in rural areas. So I talked about things that don't work. Now I'm talking about things that do work, that do reduce collisions with animals. The most commonly applied measure, most effective, is wildlife fences. It can be standard ungulate fences for deer and elk, 2.4 meters high, 8 feet tall on the left-hand side. But you can also have a multi-species approach on the right-hand side, where it's not just about the large animals, but the plastic sheets, the black sheets at the bottom, are to keep amphibians and reptiles out of the road corridor. The smaller mesh fencing can be for medium-sized mammals, such as Eurasian badger. And higher up, you'll have larger mesh sizes that still keep the large ungulates, the deer and the elk, out of the right-of-way. So you can design your fence if you know what species you want to keep out of the road corridor, if you know what species you don't want to be hit. So designing your fence for the target species and knowing what their capabilities are, their climbing capabilities, digging capabilities, jumping capabilities, how strong they are, being capable of pushing over a fence post, for example, it all influences and informs your design of a fence. But you also have to implement them over long distances. And this is where this graph comes in. On the horizontal axis, we have the road length that is fenced with or without underpasses or overpasses. And on the vertical axis, we have the effectiveness. By what percentage do we reduce collisions with large wild mammals? Now, we almost always reduce collisions by 80 to 100% if we build these fences over at least 5 kilometers of road or 3 miles of road. When we have shorter distances, the average effectiveness drops to about 50% and becomes highly variable from location to location. It has to do with fence and effects. I don't have time to go into that, but if you want to ask a question about that, that's fine. Now, fences alone result in an absolute barrier in the landscape, and that is bad practice. We cannot build these fences without also providing for safe crossing opportunities for wildlife. Now, here's an overview of different types and dimensions of crossing structures. On the upper left, a vegetated wildlife overpass with shrubs and trees and grasses and herbs on top. And there's also various types and dimensions of underpasses, large bridges, large mammal culverts, to smaller culverts on the lower right. Now, some people say these structures, especially these structures, are quite expensive. Why don't we just build fences and every now and then have a gap in the fence and allow animals to cross at the same surface that the vehicles drive on? Well, then there's these data from my colleagues in Arizona, and it's actually quite interesting. On the horizontal axis, we have traffic volume. Now, if we first look at the lower line, the one with the circles, it shows that at very low traffic volume on the left hand of the circle, about 75% of the elk that are wearing a GPS radio collar, they end up on the other side of the highway. So quite good. But as you increase traffic volume, you move towards the right on the graph, there's an exponential decrease in the likelihood that these elk end up on the other side of the highway. So higher traffic volume results in a greater barrier effect. Now then look at the upper line, the one with the triangles. This shows a situation where we have fences in combination with underpasses, and we also have these elk in the same study area again. And essentially, the likelihood that the elk will end up on the other side of the highway is independent of the traffic volume. So what does it tell us? It tells us that we need a physical separation of animals and traffic, especially for busy highways, because you may provide an at-grade crossing opportunity where animals walk on the road surface, but they don't want to do that anymore, especially when the traffic volume increases. Another change or turning our way of thinking is the following. Typically, over the last few decades, when we build underpasses, overpasses, there's monitoring. Monitoring of wildlife use, how many individuals of what species use these structures over what time period. Now, these data come from the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, and it's mostly deer species, but there's also relatively rare and threatened species, including grizzly bear, that use these structures. That's all great. It's substantial. We had almost 100,000 successful crossings by 20 different wild, medium, and large mammal species over this time period. But use is not the same as effectiveness. And what is good enough for me, a high enough number for me, might not make you happy. So there's a difference between measuring use and measuring effectiveness, and that is a change that we have to make. A little bit more about those crossing structures. Each column in this table represents a different type and combination of type and dimension of crossing structure, ranging from wildlife overpasses on the left to more narrow underpasses and culverts on the right. And each line represents a species. Whenever there's a black dot in a cell, it means that we consider that type of crossing structure and dimensions suitable for that species. And whenever there's a circle with a cross, we consider it not suitable. So my point is this: if you know what species you want to provide connectivity for, we have a pretty good idea of what type of structure and what dimension of structure would be best suited for those animals and allow them to readily access the other side of the highway. Another change in our thinking has to do with time. These data again come from the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, and we measured 5 years after the completion of the construction of individual crossing structures, dozens of crossing structures. And first look at the black line with the black dots. 1 year after completion of the structures, there were 4,000 deer moving through these structures. And after 5 years, it has increased to 8,000, and it hasn't quite leveled off yet. It hasn't reached an asymptote. Now for bear, there's a similar pattern present. Now this means that if you measure wildlife use or any other effectiveness measure in the first few years, you will by definition have lower numbers than after 5 years or after 10 years. I'm not saying it's wrong to measure in the first few years, but it's a dynamic environment. Apparently the animals learn about the location of the structures and that it is safe to use them, and they use them more readily as the structures age. Another way to look at how these structures function and how effective they are is to have a before and after study. Here there's a road before where there's no mitigation in place, and after the road has been widened and it has been fenced, and now the animals only can cross at the underpasses and in this case one overpass. If you look at the left hand side for deer, we actually have more deer moving through the structures than ever crossed at grade before the road was widened. So we actually increased habitat connectivity for this species, and it was actually significant. The same pattern is present on the right hand side for black bear, but probably because of the sample size, it's not quite significant. Yet another way to look at effectiveness is place cameras at each end of a structure. In this case, our structure was 7 meters wide, 4 meters high, and we had 15 of these structures. And then we also placed cameras at random locations in the surrounding landscape. And our question was, are we funneling animals? Are there more animals moving through the underpass compared to random locations in the immediate surroundings? And the answer is yes. 146% more movements through the structure than at a random location in the immediate vicinity. But if your reference is the number of animal movements we see close to the highway, then we would have to build these structures over 41% of the road length. If you build these structures over 41% of the road length, basically essentially make half of the road permeable, then would basically be erasing the barrier effect for individuals and species that are willing to live close to the highway. Now, I'm not saying that that is what we have to do, but it does put it into perspective, because in reality, we only build one structure per mile or so, and we are not even close to that level. It may still be sufficient for gene flow. It may still be sufficient to allow for seasonal migration. It may even allow for viable wildlife populations. But looking at these things in different ways helps us understand the level at which we are addressing the problem, and also what remains not addressed. Yet another way to look at it is a population viability perspective. This is the country of Bulgaria. On the right, on the left-hand side, we see the current situation. These lines, the red lines and the orange lines, represent major infrastructure, roads and railroads. And the green areas and the red areas, they are habitat for brown bear, same as grizzly bear. And habitat in green means it's large enough and connected well enough to other habitat that we have a viable population, at least a potential for viable population. Areas in red means the areas are too small, they're too fragmented to sustain a viable population. Now, the map on the right-hand side shows a theoretical situation where problem locations have been addressed. There's reduction in mortality on the highway, and we now allow for safe crossing opportunities. And many of the areas that were red, not viable, are now green, and we can allow brown bear to live there, at least in theory. It doesn't mean that we can address everything. The area in the extreme southeast of Bulgaria remains red. That means we need to do more. We cannot only solve the issue with road mitigation, we need to do more in the meshes of the landscape to allow for connectivity there and have a viable population there. Now, I really have been working up to what I'm saying now. We have to really define what we want to achieve. We have to define what our parameters of success are. If we do not do that, we can never evaluate whether or not we reached our objectives. And related to this, our objectives must always be consistent with the measures we propose and that we implement. If we have a disconnect between our objectives and the measures we propose or the measures we implement, We basically have a problem from the get-go. Now, it seems very basic, but I know of many examples where the objectives are not consistent with the measures. If they're not consistent, then they have to go back. Either lower your objectives or you have to change your measures. But they must be consistent. And that brings me to our ambition level. What do we want? A very low ambition level would be to just build structures because you're legally required. And regardless of the wildlife usage, if it has been built and if it doesn't collapse, success. Independent of how many or how few wildlife actually use it. And somebody else might want to see substantial wildlife use. Others might want to see more viable wildlife population as a result of reduction in unnatural mortality and more connectivity. Others might be focused on ecosystem processes, including long distance migration, for example, for ungulates. And others might be even more ambitious and say, you know what, it is not about individual species, it's about entire ecosystems, and those ecosystems being able to move as the climate changes. So what I want to argue here is that we have to set higher ambition levels, be more ambitious. And that also relates to how we build it and how we leave it. On the left-hand side, underpass and an overpass, it is there, it is physically there. Animals could potentially move over it, and the cars drive over and under these structures, but there's no habitat, it's completely barren. And this is not good, especially not for species that are slow moving and small. For example, a salamander may only move about 10 meters per day. If you have a corridor that is 150 meters wide, 4 lanes on each side with a median in between, it takes weeks for a salamander to get to the other side of the highway. So clearly, we have to provide habitat, we have to provide shelter, we have to provide food and water along the way. We have to provide habitat. Now, from a biological conservation perspective, we need to work in a landscape. We have habitat patches in which the animals are able to live, and they may need to be able to move between those habitat patches. But when we're dealing with a road project, we're typically dealing with a line in the landscape. So this is a problem because the biological component of it is actually landscape based. So we have to think in a landscape approach and have a landscape approach rather than a traditional linear road project, which is a traditional engineering approach. It's not impossible to have a landscape approach. This is from my home country in the Netherlands. On the map on the left-hand side shows the country, and at the end of the 1980s, the Department of Nature Management created this map. Where do we have natural habitat? Where do we have corridors? Where do we want to expand our core areas and corridors? And then the Department of Transportation took that, and they have been taking action for decades already, but they now took that and had a more coordinated nationwide approach and said, we are overlaying the transportation network with this habitat and corridor map. Where do we have problem areas, and what species does it involve, and what does that mean for the types of measures we have to take at different locations? And then they initiated a multi-decade long defragmentation program. This is quite the achievement with different governments, of course, with different interests, but a long-term vision and a long-term commitment that actually was completed just a few years ago. And the map on the far right shows locations where wildlife overpasses have been constructed. And there's 68 of them in an area that's about 400 kilometers north to south and 150 kilometers east to west. So small area, high concentration of wildlife overpasses. Mind you, there are hundreds and thousands of other mitigation measures as well, including underpasses and small culverts. What do these things look like? The lower right is probably the largest overpass in the world. It is half a mile long, 800 meters long, and it spans a 2-lane road, a 2-lane railroad, a railroad yard, and a field hockey complex. There's bridges over the infrastructure and embankments where they don't need a bridge. But this entire corridor connecting forest and heathlands is 800 meters long and at its narrowest 50 meters wide. Lower left, we see a heathland system also in the Netherlands and an overpass. And here the road was lowered so that the animals do not have to walk up an overpass. They can see straight across. The landscape is flat and their approach to the overpass is similar to their surrounding landscape. And that is considered good practice. Make the approaches be similar to that of the surrounding landscape and as gradual as possible is considered better than having a steep slope. We also have to provide furniture on these structures for small species, invertebrates, small mammals, amphibians, reptiles. Upper left, we see root wads leading to an overpass. On the upper right, we see a berm with vegetation that reduces the sound and the light pollution for the animals that cross on the overpass. So it's really important to think about the design details. Another change we have to make, another turn, so you will, is to get over the idea that this is expensive. Yes, it is expensive to build fences, to build underpasses, to build overpasses, but we're also able to save money. And it's not about the cost of the mitigation measures, it's about the balance between the costs and the benefits. And I'll explain that. If we do nothing, we have wildlife vehicle collisions. These cost money. Here we have costs associated with deer, elk, and moose vehicle collisions, vehicle repair costs, and occasional human injury and human fatality. We don't know which results in human injuries and human fatalities, but we allocate a proportion of these high dollar values to each collision. When you add it all up, it's $6,600 for an average deer vehicle collision, up to $30,000 for a moose vehicle collisions, primarily based on human safety parameters. And these are also the dollar amounts we can save if we have fewer collisions because we implement mitigation. We ran the models over a 75-year-long time period, and we did that because the costs are in year 1 and the benefits must be obtained over the entirety of the lifespan. Here's a real road, a situation in Montana, Highway 83, Seeley Swan, and on the horizontal axis we have mileposts. And the jagged line represents the cost, and that's on the vertical axis in dollars per kilometer per year of collisions with large wild mammals. These are real data. These are not in a model, these are real historical data. And it shows you that especially in the first 15 miles or so, there is a concentration of collisions and a high cost. And whenever you cross those horizontal lines, it becomes really interesting. Those horizontal lines represent thresholds. These are the costs associated with different types and combinations of mitigation measures. If the jagged line meets or exceeds the thresholds, it means it is less expensive to implement mitigation than it is to do nothing. And this is a conservative approach because it only is based on human safety parameters and it doesn't include the costs and benefits of biological conservation. If you do include the latter, the thresholds will lower and it is even more interesting to implement mitigation. Final perspective, final turn. I talked about how this work is good for human safety. It's also good for biological conservation, and it can even make economic sense. It can also make sense from a hydrology perspective in the context of climate change. That's the lower left here. If we have narrow culverts that are designed based on 100-year flood data, then we actually find that we have a 100-year flood every 5 years nowadays. And we have plugged culverts, failed roads, super expensive to repair. So why don't we just make them a little bit bigger? And we don't have to have those repair costs and the maintenance headaches. And if you build them bigger, you might not need a bottom. You might have a natural substrate for the stream. You might have riparian habitat and also an area for terrestrial animals to cross. So there's a shared interest here. There's also a shared interest with recreation. It's not just animals that need to move across the landscape. We need to cross major infrastructure too. When we run, when we ride our bikes, ride a horse, and major infrastructure is a barrier. What if we can combine wildlife use and recreational use? And this is also important when we think about our physical and mental health. We need to be able to move out in nature. I'm not saying that combined use is always a good idea. It is especially a good idea if you have multifunctional landscapes and species that live in these landscapes that are adapted to a certain level of human presence and disturbance. If you have pristine landscapes, sensitive species, then it is best to separate it and perhaps not have humans at all in those types of landscapes. But there is an opportunity there, because if you work with these shared interests, these other stakeholders, you might be able to build more structures more quickly, and the net result for biological conservation as well as human safety might be much greater. And that leaves me at the end of my talk. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for tuning in. I would like to thank the funders that make our work possible, and also the practitioners that take our work and do good in the world. And I'll hand it over to Tremaine for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcel. That was a wonderful talk, and I really appreciate all of the details. We're interested in doing a lot more road mitigation research in the tropics in South America, and I think a lot of the lessons that you described are very applicable. I have a number of questions here, and so I'll just start with the first one. This first question asks, did you find that there is a relationship between hotspots of wildlife collisions and environmental variables such as topography, land cover, freshwater presence, etc.?
The short answer is yes, absolutely, but it depends on the species. So especially if you have species that are habitat specialists, then you find very close relationships, but those relationships might be different for different species because they live in different habitat. And for habitat generalists, they typically have collisions that are very widespread, but not necessarily random. For example, white-tailed deer in North America, heavily associated with edge habitat, transitions from forest to, say, grassland or arable land. So it's highly variable depending on the species.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. We have a number of other questions here. The next question is, what is your strategy to convince road owners and managers to invest in implementing safeguards for monitoring wildlife? That's a major question of mine also.
Right. Basically, what is the motivation? What is the argumentation I use to convince agencies that are managing roads to implement this type of mitigation? Well, I just mentioned, three major pillars of this work. It's human safety, it's biological conservation, it's economics, and more at the forefront, it's climate change, dealing with hydrology, and recreation and human and physical health. But it is interesting because I do work in different places of the planet, and what is considered impossible in one country is actually commonplace in another. And it shows me that it is a cultural choice. Eventually, you come down to the conclusion that it's based on our values that we have as a society and the mandates that we give to our agencies. And if they are not consistent with the values that we have in a society, where we want many different things and we want it to be balanced, we have to rethink what the mandates are that we give to our agencies. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah, I can imagine that's the case. You really have to speak to the hearts of the decision makers that you're talking to too. Okay, the next question is, to what degree have you seen roads as a means of introducing non-native / invasive species, and how much do they affect neighboring habitat?
It is absolutely an issue. It's especially known for plants, plant species, weeds, when they're non-native and invasive. Knapweed in North America is a major example. Roadsides color purple in the summer from knapweed, and it's very visible to see this non-native invasive species spread along the road corridor and from there into the surrounding areas. And because they have these colors, these flowers, it's quite noticeable. To what degree is the problem? It is a very severe problem, most notably in areas where we have roads going through open habitat, because we are creating an open disturbed habitat in the right of way, and species that like to live in that open disturbed habitat, if the surrounding natural habitat is somewhat similar, like grasslands, this is a particular problem. In forests, they typically shade out the grassland plants, right? So it is context dependent based on the vegetation, the natural vegetation, but also context dependent on, say, our agricultural activities.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're getting questions as you speak, so I'm excited that there's a lot of interest in what you have to say. Okay, the next question is, your research shows that animals, you showed us deer and bear, are learning to use crossing structure points more reliably over time. Is there any risk that the top predators of these ecosystems will learn about these habitat bottlenecks and make them impassable by hunting exclusively where they know these smaller animals will be crossing? Is that something that we should consider, especially if there are vulnerable, threatened, or endangered species in the areas that we plan to implement these animal crossings?
The short answer is we have not been able to measure this. It may happen in occasional situations that a predator kills a prey species in or at a structure. Absolutely, that happens. But it is not a phenomenon that is widespread and of concern. There has been literature review, several empirical studies based on snow tracking, seeing if predators hang out at the structures based on the tracks in the snow. The location of carcasses before and after the implementation of these mitigation measures, are they then closer to the structures compared to before mitigation measures were implemented? The answer is no. There's also been, the camera data, a closer association, that's the question, in time as the structures age between predators and prey. There's also no evidence of that. And it is true that we have many more large mammals moving through structures, primarily deer and other ungulates in North America, as the structures age. So the question or the hypothesis is logical. Do the predators respond to that? But I think what predators look for is not necessary, but you can't compare it to, say, a random location in the landscape. So even though we funnel animals in the crossing structures, I think a predator is able to hunt more efficiently in the surrounding landscape away from human disturbance. Also, human disturbance is dangerous to them. So they can be more effective as a hunter because they're specialized. They're not hunting randomly in the surrounding landscape. And I think they can be far more effective using their hunting skills that they've evolved over the eons compared to just lying and waiting passively at an underpass. Yeah, it is better than a random location in the landscape, but hunters, predators are able to hunt with more success than just at a random location. They're very picky about how and where they hunt.
Yeah, I would just say from my experience, which is a little bit different, but with canopy bridges, natural canopy bridges in Peru, in that study, we did not find predators to be hunting for arboreal mammals at those locations. I think that we didn't really focus on that question, but I think they could have more success at other locations. There wouldn't be sufficient, wouldn't be worth the cost, the time cost. Exactly. Okay, and following up on that question, another person in the audience says that that was a lovely overview. Thank you. As you know, the realities in many tropical countries are a little different. I'd love to hear some more about your experience in Brazil, particularly in terms of incentives, the feasibility of fences, talking also about people stealing the materials that the fences are made with, and then use of underpasses without fencing, and then the hunting issue that you were just discussing.
Yep. Yeah, it is not easy, and not everywhere on the planet we have the same situation. It is true that especially in tropical countries and poor countries, that we have to design fences not only for wildlife, but also make them vandalism and theft resistant. The underpasses without fences. The primary measure, if your objective is to reduce collisions, if one of your objectives is to reduce collisions, you have to build barriers, typically fences. Crossing structures alone, without fences, do not necessarily reduce the number of collisions. The primary function of the crossing structure is to provide safe crossing opportunities. And yes, there is an interaction fences not only keep the animals off the road, but they also help funnel wildlife towards the crossing structures. And yes, if you do build enough crossing structures at the right location for their target species, the right type, the right dimension, then it becomes less of an incentive for the animals to just break through the fence and get killed on the highway that way, because there's a suitable crossing structure nearby. So we need a combination of the two. We can't have one or the other. If we have the two objectives, one, reduce collisions, and two, provide habitat connectivity. We must have a combination of the two, and just crossing structures alone do not necessarily reduce the number of collisions. Does that answer the questions?
Yes, I think so. And then this person also asked about the hunting issue that we were discussing. I would think that would be universal.
I would say there's a parallel with the predators, right? I would say if people hunt at an underpass or an overpass, it is a reflection of their poor hunting skills, because they should be able, similar to a natural predator, an animal, to be doing much better if they veer away from the road and know what they're doing. So it's more of a reflection of poor hunting skills, I would say.
Yeah. Also, with the canopy bridges, having sitting under a canopy bridge to wait for an animal to cross, you'd have to sit for a very long time to catch one. In other words, crossing is not so frequent that the time
exactly
would be
exactly.
Okay, the next comment is great presentation. I know you were working on an update to your cost benefit model. Where are you with that? And were you able to include I think it should be conservation value?
Right. Yeah, this is something my colleagues and I are working on. It's primarily bioeconomists that are working on this. It's partially published in a report already. For example, the economic value of an elk in a protected area is several tens of thousands of dollars, right? And it easily matches or doubles what the value of an elk is in terms of avoiding a collision. When it comes to threatened and endangered species like wolves and grizzly bear, the individual value of an individual animal is several millions of dollars. And it really, these are indicative values. We don't have it for all the species. We just have it for very few species in specific contexts. This is all true. But what it illustrates is that when we add economic parameters related to biological conservation, that we might substantially lower those thresholds above it is economically interesting to implement mitigation. We are able to justify mitigation more readily based on economics when we include these biological conservation parameters. We are also still working on expanded parameters related to biological conservation. It's a frontier, but it is clear the direction things are going. The more parameters we include, the more interesting it becomes to implement mitigation. And we realize, looking back at the past, that maybe we were too careful. We were too concerned. It really makes a lot of sense, and it should be an integral approach of how we deal with infrastructure. If we have to have infrastructure, it's better to not have infrastructure, at least from a biological conservation perspective. But if you have infrastructure, or if you have to build new infrastructure, then it should be an integral component of it, these types of measures.
Okay, definitely. And then another question here about the cost-benefit analysis. Has the cost-benefit analysis been done for species that don't even bother to cross the road due to the barrier effect and lack of wildlife vehicle collision data?
No, it's a very good question, and it is something that concerns me. We're definitely not done with regard to studying the impacts and also our ways to provide solutions. Animals that are not individuals and species that are not willing to come close to the highway can never be served by the mitigation measures that we provide along the highway, right? So those are super sensitive species, and those are the species we need roadless areas for, and they need to be large enough to sustain viable populations. In the rare cases where we have dispersers, animals that migrate without the intent of coming back to the native area, we still must provide crossing structures that are considered suitable for those species that normally wouldn't think about coming close to infrastructure. But this is one of the frontiers, and we know very little about it. And just because we have good data for individuals and species willing to live close to the highway doesn't mean that we're done. This is one of the frontiers.
Okay. Here's another question. Have you found that roadkill hotspot locations also line up with movement locations of animals, or are some locations on roads more quote unquote deadly than others?
Yeah, it is true. Sometimes there's overlap and sometimes there's not. But it is good practice to use both road mortality data and observations of animals seen alive on or near the highway when you plan for mitigation measures. If you only use road mortality data, you might provide crossing structures where you have a concentration of dead animals and fences in between, but then you run the risk that you're now blocking off areas where animals have been crossing successfully without being hit. Now, if you have data based on maybe wildlife studies with radio collars, or if that is all not a possibility because there's no time and there's no money, especially not money to study so many different animal species, you might use citizen science. You might interview people who travel the roadway or continue to travel the roadway and document where do they see animals, not only the ones that are dead, but perhaps especially the ones that are alive. And if you use the combination of data, you're less likely to block wildlife where they have been crossing successfully and where they're not showing up in the road mortality data.
Okay. Okay, and this is an interesting question about bats, an animal that people have been talking a lot about recently, very important members of our ecosystems. Are you aware of underpasses that have been built for terrestrial wildlife but also include features to encourage roosting by bats? If so, are they successful in meeting goals for both types of use?
Right, I absolutely, I know that people provide habitat, roosting habitat under existing bridges, new build bridges, typically to compensate for maybe old trees that have been chopped in the immediate vicinity in association with a road reconstruction project. I think the results are pretty mixed with regard to the success of bats reestablishing themselves in these artificial roosting sites. It is something that people are working on and try to achieve better success. There's also features in the landscape that bats use when they navigate. Certain species use hedgerows, for example, and you can use that knowledge when you are thinking about the vegetation on an overpass and how it connects to, say, hedgerows in the surrounding landscape. But not every species is the same. Hope that more or less answers the question. We don't know everything about it, and there's not 100% success there either.
Definitely an opportunity though. Okay, here's another question. Are there data for species other than the ones you showed in the table with the black circles? Those species do not occur where I work. Is there a repository that includes information for places other than North America?
Well, we have similar tables for species in Europe, but it is something that people can and perhaps should work on in their geographical area. And this is what I've been talking to with my students also. You know, instead of putting cameras, this is the standard wildlife monitoring method for structures. Instead of putting cameras in the center of a structure, put them at the edge. Have them look out. And then we can see the species and the individuals that approach. And we can evaluate the behavior. Do they cross? Do they not cross? Now our statistical population is the animals that are willing to come close to the structure. And we can calculate this structure, what percentage of the individuals of this species went through and what percentage did reject the structure. And maybe we should argue, and there's no such standard at the moment, that in order to call a structure suitable for a particular species, we need to see 70 or 80% acceptance rate. If it is lower, yes, there's still animals moving through it, but it doesn't mean it's suitable, especially not if you're in this, 20%, 10%. Yes, we occasionally have animals move through it, but it's not suitable for the species because 80% turns around. So this is something we together have to develop there is no overarching project, but I would like to work together with people and think about methodology, and perhaps even work on a standardized database at some point that has species for different parts of the world.
Yeah, a point you made just occurred to something that I've thought a lot about too when monitoring in the canopy with camera traps. I would imagine on the ground it would be similar, that having a camera with video capacity when you're trying to evaluate the response of the animal to the crossing structure can be really helpful, even though it'll fill up your memory card a lot faster. But you can get also a lot more information on the choice that the animal is making, how they're responding to the structure, if you can have video.
Yep.
Okay, I think I should just address one more question because we're going 1 minute over time here. This person asked, speaking to the fences, I'd like to hear more about the fence end effects mentioned earlier in the talk, how to detect those effects and how to prevent them.
Okay, well, the best way to prevent animals concentrating their crossings at the fence end and getting in between them is to look at the data of dead and live animals, look at the habitat, and have that inform where you start and end fences. Also include the topography, not just the vegetation. Also involve the radius of the home range of your target species. It is very context dependent. Those are the factors that go into it. But when it comes to large mammals, the fundamental principle is you have to build them over many miles of road. That is the spatial scale you have to be thinking about. And the precise locations where you start and end the fence are always dependent on the context of the landscape. What is the target species? What is their preferred habitat? How far can they walk? What is the topography? Do we have steep slopes that are a good fit for a fence end and a start of a fence, and prevent animals crossing a high concentration right where it starts and ends? Those are the things you have to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to address this one question here that probably I should be addressing. Will the PowerPoint be available after the presentation? We've recorded this presentation today, so it should be available on the Earth Optimism website in the future. I don't know exactly when that will be, but that if you just keep checking back on the website in the future, you should be able to find it. Otherwise, you can contact Marcel. I believe, yeah, his email address is right there on the screen. And Marcel, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, just thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest in the topic. And the bottom line is, I think we have a lot of knowledge, and we are able to do a lot of good things for the planet and the species that we share the planet with.
Yes, thank you everyone so much for attending. Thank you, Marcel. We actually had over 200 attendees today, so while you all might have felt alone in your offices and your homes, you were surrounded by many others, and I really appreciate your interest in Earth Optimism and in this talk today. Thank you. Happy Earth Day.